Welcome back to Dark Hours, where the quietest places often hide the loudest secrets. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of small-town horror stories, true accounts of strange sightings, unexplained disappearances, and the kind of mysteries that only happen far from the city lights. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and before we begin, drop a comment telling us the time and place you're watching from. Let's see who's tuning in from a small town of their own. I still hear it sometimes, even though I'm 3 states away now. Even though I left that town 6 years ago and swore I'd never go back. The bell. That goddamn bell in the church tower that rang every night at 3:17 a.m. and nobody, not a single soul in that town, would ever talk about why. My name is Rebecca Haynes, and I grew up in Milford Creek, population 847, a place so small you could walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. A place where everyone knew everyone's business. Except for this one thing, this one horrible secret that nobody would speak out loud. I was 16 when I started asking questions, and by the time I turned 17, I understood why silence was the only mercy left in that town. Milford Creek sat in a valley in northern Pennsylvania, surrounded by hills thick with pine trees that blocked out the sun for most of the day, making everything feel darker than it should, making even summer afternoons feel like early evening. The church was at the center of town, an old stone building with a bell tower that rose up above everything else, visible from every street, every window, like it was watching us all. The church itself hadn't held services in 40 years, not since Reverend Marsh disappeared. But the building was still there, still standing, and the bell still rang every single night at exactly 3:17 a.m. I'd been hearing it my whole life. That deep bronze sound that cut through the darkness and woke you up even if you were dreaming, even if you were exhausted, even if you'd trained yourself to sleep through anything. It would ring 7 times, always 7, and then stop. And the silence afterward was somehow worse than the ringing because you'd lie there in your bed knowing that everyone else in town was awake too, lying in their beds, staring at their ceilings, waiting for morning to come. Nobody talked about it. That was the rule, the unspoken law that everyone followed without question. You didn't ask why the bell rang. You didn't wonder who was ringing it. You didn't discuss it at breakfast or at school or at the grocery store. It was like the bell existed in this separate reality that we all experienced but refused to acknowledge. And when I was younger, I accepted this the way children accept all the strange rules adults make, thinking it was just another quirk of small-town life. But when I turned 16, something changed in me. Some part of my brain that had been willing to accept mystery suddenly demanded answers, and I started asking my parents about the bell. My mother's face went white when I brought it up at dinner one night, and my father just stood up from the table and walked outside without saying a word. And I sat there with my little brother Tommy, who was only 9 years old, and I saw in his eyes that he was scared, genuinely terrified, and I realized that even though nobody talked about it, everybody was afraid. I asked my history teacher, Mrs. Carson, who'd lived in Milford Creek her entire 73 years. She was in the middle of explaining the Civil War when I raised my hand and asked her straight out why the church bell rang every night, and the classroom went so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Mrs. Carson's mouth opened and closed a few times, and then she said in this very soft, very careful voice that some questions don't have answers worth knowing, and we should move on to discussing the Battle of Gettysburg. But her hands were shaking when she picked up her chalk, and I noticed that she kept glancing at the window, at the church tower visible in the distance, like she expected something to be looking back at her. I tried asking at the diner where all the old men gathered every morning for coffee. I walked in on a Saturday and went straight to their table in the back corner and asked them about the bell, and the conversation stopped so abruptly. It was like someone had pressed a pause button on reality. 6 old men stared at me with expressions that cycled through shock and fear and something that might have been pity. And then old Joe Kemmer, who'd been the sheriff before he retired. He leaned forward and said in this raspy voice that I needed to stop asking questions, that there were things in this town that were better left alone, that my parents should have taught me to keep my mouth shut about certain subjects. His hand was gripping his coffee cup so hard I thought it might shatter, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple, and I backed away from their table and left the diner with my heart pounding, because I'd never seen adults look that frightened before. That night the bell rang at 3:17 a.m. like it always did, and I lay in my bed counting the 7 rings, and when they stopped I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth even if nobody would tell me. I was going to go to the church and see for myself who or what was ringing that bell. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage. 3 weeks of lying awake after the bell rang, imagining what I might find, creating scenarios in my head that ranged from the mundane, some automated system, some mechanism left over from decades ago, to the terrifying, though I couldn't quite articulate what the terrifying version was, just a vague sense of wrongness, of something unholy happening in that tower. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be a rational explanation, that the town's silence was just small-town weirdness taken to an extreme. But every time I looked at the church during the day, at its dark windows and weathered stone, I felt this coldness in my stomach, this instinctive warning that some doors should never be opened. I finally did it on a Thursday night in October. I waited until my parents were asleep, until the whole house was quiet except for the sound of my father's snoring drifting down the hallway. And then I got dressed in dark clothes and climbed out my bedroom window onto the porch roof and down the trellis to the backyard. The town was completely silent. Every house dark, every street empty, and the moon was just a thin crescent that barely provided any light. I had a flashlight in my pocket, but I didn't want to use it yet, didn't want to draw attention, so I walked through the darkness using memory and the faint glow from the occasional streetlight. The church was only 4 blocks from my house, and I made it there in less than 10 minutes, my breath coming fast and shallow, my hands trembling. The church looked different at night. During the day it was just an old abandoned building, sad and forgotten, but in the darkness it seemed alive somehow, seemed to crouch in its lot like some huge stone animal waiting for prey. The front doors were chained shut and had been for as long as I could remember, but I'd heard there was a side entrance that sometimes opened, a small door that led into the basement. I found it after walking around the building twice, my flashlight beam finally catching the outline of a wooden door set low in the foundation. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed. It hung open about 3 inches, and when I pulled it wider, the hinges screamed in protest, a sound so loud in the quiet night that I froze, certain that every person in town had heard it and would come running. But nobody came. The silence returned, and I stepped through the doorway into absolute darkness. The smell hit me first, damp stone and rot and something else. Something sweet and wrong, like flowers left too long in a vase. I turned on my flashlight and the beam showed me a narrow hallway with a low ceiling, stone walls glistening with moisture, puddles of black water on the floor. I moved forward slowly, trying not to splash, trying to breathe through my mouth to avoid the smell. The hallway ended at a set of stairs going up, wooden stairs that looked ancient and unstable, and I tested the first step carefully before putting my full weight on it. It held. I climbed slowly, counting each step, 14 in total, and emerged into what must have been the main floor of the church. My flashlight swept across rows of pews covered in dust and cobwebs, across broken stained glass windows that let in fragments of moonlight, across an altar at the far end that was bare except for a large book lying open. The ceiling soared above me, disappearing into shadows, and I could see the opening to the bell tower in the corner, a dark doorway with stairs spiraling up into blackness. I checked my watch. It was 3:09 a.m. 8 minutes until the bell would ring. 8 minutes to climb up there and see what was happening. I forced myself to move toward the tower stairs. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, to get out of this church and never come back. But I'd come this far, and I needed to know. The tower stairs were even worse than the basement stairs, narrow and steep and spiraling up into darkness, so complete my flashlight barely made a dent in it. I climbed carefully, one hand on the wall, feeling the cold stone under my palm, counting the steps because it gave me something to focus on besides the growing terror in my chest. 20 steps, 30, 40. My legs burned and my breath came in gasps, and I wanted to stop, but I kept going because I could feel time passing, could feel 3:17 approaching like a wave that was going to crash over me whether I was ready or not. I reached the top at 3:14 a.m. The bell chamber was a square room with open arches on all 4 sides, and in the center hung the bell, massive and bronze and covered in verdigris. But that's not what made me stop breathing. That's not what made my flashlight slip from my trembling hand and clatter on the wooden floor. It was the people. There were 7 of them, standing in a circle around the bell, their backs to me, perfectly still, perfectly silent. They were wearing ordinary clothes, normal clothes from different eras. I could see a woman in a dress that looked like it was from the 1950s, a man in a suit from maybe the 1970s, another woman in jeans and a t-shirt that could have been from last year. They didn't move when my flashlight fell, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. They just stood there facing the bell, and I realized, with a horror that made my knees weak, that I recognized some of them. The woman in the jeans and t-shirt was Sarah Morrison. She'd disappeared 2 years ago, vanished on her way home from work, and the whole town had searched for weeks but never found any trace of her. The man in the suit was Thomas Green, who, my father said, had left town in 1987 to take a job in Pittsburgh and never came back. And the woman in the 1950s dress, I'd seen her picture in my grandmother's photo album. Heard the story about how she'd been my grandmother's best friend until she disappeared one night without explanation, and everyone assumed she'd run away to the city like young people sometimes did back then. My watch beeped softly. 3:17 a.m. The seven figures raised their arms in unison, reaching for the bell's rope, and I saw that their hands were wrong, withered and gray like they'd been dead for years, like the flesh had rotted away, leaving only dried skin stretched over bone. They pulled the rope together and the bell rang, that deep bronze sound that I'd heard every night of my life, and the sound was so loud in the confined space that I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound went through my hands, through my skull, vibrating in my bones and teeth and making my vision blur. The bell rang a second time, a third. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Tried to do anything except stand there frozen while the bell rang 4, 5, 6 times. On the seventh ring, all seven figures turned to look at me simultaneously, and their faces were rotted, eyes sunken or missing entirely, mouths hanging open in silent screams, and I finally found the ability to move, to stumble backward toward the stairs, to run down those spiral steps in complete darkness, falling twice, skinning my hands and knees on the stone, not caring, just needing to get out, to get away. I burst out of the church through the basement door and ran through the dark streets of Milford Creek, ran all the way home, climbed back up the trellis and through my window, and into my bed where I pulled the covers over my head and shook until morning came. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. How could I? Who would believe me? And more importantly, I finally understood why nobody talked about the bell, because talking about it meant acknowledging what it meant. And what it meant was that everyone who disappeared from Milford Creek over the decades, they hadn't left at all. They were still here, still in the church tower, still trapped in some horrible state between life and death. Condemned to ring that bell every night at 3:17 a.m. for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. I left Milford Creek the day I turned 18, went to college on the other side of the state, and I've never gone back, not even for holidays, not even when my grandmother died. My parents still live there. My brother Tommy still lives there. Though he's 21 now and I keep begging him to leave, to get out while he still can. He won't. He says it's home. He says the bell is just part of life there, something you get used to. But I can hear in his voice that he's lying, that he's terrified, that he knows what I know, that the bell chooses people sometimes, that people disappear from Milford Creek with a regularity that nobody wants to calculate, that one night the bell might decide it needs 8 figures instead of 7. I still hear it sometimes, even though I'm 3 states away, even though that's impossible, even though I know it's just my imagination or my memory or my guilt for leaving everyone I love behind in that cursed town. I hear it at 3:17 a.m. and I lie awake in my apartment counting the rings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I wait for an 8th ring that hasn't come yet, but I know someday will. And when it does, I'll know that someone else has joined that circle in the tower. Someone else has disappeared into whatever horror lives in that church. And I pray every night that it's not my brother, that it's not my parents, that it's not anyone I know. But I also know that prayer means nothing in Milford Creek, because that bell has been ringing for at least 70 years. And it's never stopped, and nobody has ever been able to explain why or make it end. The worst part is knowing that someday I might have to go back, that something might happen that forces me to return to Milford Creek, and when I do, when I walk down those familiar streets and see that church tower rising above everything else, the bell will be waiting for me, and the 7 figures in the tower will be waiting too, and maybe I'll finally understand why they ring it, what purpose it serves, what horrible truth the whole town has been protecting through their silence. But by the time I understand, it will be too late, because I'll be standing in that circle myself, reaching for the rope, ringing the bell 7 times every night at 3:17 a.m. Trapped forever in the place I tried so hard to escape. There's a photograph on my phone that I can't delete, and believe me, I've tried. I've tried hundreds of times, but every time I think it's gone, it reappears in my camera roll like it's mocking me, like it wants me to remember what I saw that summer. My name is David Torres, and I used to be a substitute teacher in Ashwood Falls, a town of maybe 1,200 people tucked into the mountains of West Virginia, where the fog rolls in thick every evening and doesn't burn off until noon the next day, where the trees grow so close together that hiking trails turn to tunnels of green, where children sometimes wandered into the woods and came back different in ways their parents couldn't quite articulate, but everyone could sense. I was 24 years old that summer, fresh out of college with an education degree I didn't know what to do with, so when my aunt called and said the elementary school in Ashwood Falls needed a long-term substitute for a teacher who'd gone on unexpected medical leave, I jumped at the opportunity. I needed the money and I needed the experience, and I thought teaching in a small town would be easy, peaceful, simple. I was wrong about all of that. I arrived in late August, when the summer heat still clung to everything and the mountains seemed to press in from all sides, and I met Principal Hayes, who was a thin, nervous woman in her 50s, who shook my hand too hard and told me I'd be teaching the 4th grade class, 22 students, good kids mostly, though there had been some behavioral issues with a few of them, and I should be patient and understanding because they'd been through trauma. "What kind of trauma?" I asked, and Principal Hayes' expression went very still, and she said that several of the children had gotten lost in the woods during a school field trip back in May, that they'd been missing for 3 days before search parties found them, and ever since then they'd been different, quieter, more withdrawn, and their parents were concerned, but the therapists said it was normal after such a frightening experience and they just needed time and stability. She didn't meet my eyes when she said this. She looked at a spot just over my left shoulder like she was reading from a script she'd memorized, and I felt uneasy, but I nodded and said I understood, and I'd do my best to help the kids feel safe. The first week of school was normal enough. The children came in every morning with their backpacks and lunch boxes, sat in their assigned seats, participated in lessons, played at recess, but I noticed certain things that bothered me in ways I couldn't quite explain. 6 of the kids, Emma, Caleb, Sophie, James, Lily, and Noah, were the ones who'd gotten lost in the woods, and they sat together in a cluster at the back of the room, even though my seating chart had them spread out. They'd moved themselves that first day, and when I tried to make them go to their assigned seats, they all looked at me with these identical blank expressions, and Emma said in this flat voice that they needed to stay together, and something about the way she said it made me decide not to push the issue. Those 6 children never played with the other kids at recess. They stood in a tight circle near the fence line, perfectly still, not talking, just standing there facing each other for the entire 20 minutes. They ate lunch the same way, sitting at their own table, their food largely untouched, just staring at each other in silence. And they never blinked. I know how insane that sounds, but I started paying attention, and I swear to God, those 6 children went entire class periods without blinking once, their eyes fixed and unmoving like glass eyes, like doll eyes. And whenever I looked at them directly, I felt this crawling sensation on the back of my neck like something was watching me from behind their faces. The other students seemed afraid of them. I noticed that nobody wanted to sit near the group of 6, that kids would go out of their way to avoid brushing against them in the hallway, that conversations would stop abruptly when one of the 6 entered a room. I asked some of the other teachers about it during lunch one day, tried to be casual about it, mentioned that Emma and her friends seemed really affected by their experience in the woods. The other teachers exchanged these loaded glances, and Mrs. Patterson, who'd been teaching 1st grade for 30 years, leaned in close and whispered that I should be careful around those children, that there was something not right about them since they came back, that parents had been calling the school asking for their kids to be moved to different classes, but Principal Hayes refused because she said segregating them would make the situation worse. "What situation?" I asked. And Mrs. Patterson just shook her head and said I'd understand soon enough. That Ashwood Falls had always had problems with the woods, that children disappeared into them regularly over the decades, and usually they never came back, but sometimes they did, and when they did, they weren't the same. They were changed in fundamental ways that nobody wanted to discuss, because discussing it meant acknowledging that something lived in those woods, something old and wrong that took children and sent back copies, empty vessels that looked right but felt wrong in every way that mattered. I thought she was being dramatic, exaggerating small-town superstition into something bigger and scarier than it was. I thought that until the incident with the drawing. It was a Wednesday in late September. I'd assigned the class a creative writing exercise where they had to draw a picture of their favorite place and then write a paragraph describing it. Most of the kids drew their homes, or the park, or the ice cream shop in town. But the 6 children who'd been lost in the woods, they all drew the same thing, exactly the same thing. I went around the room collecting the drawings, and when I got to their cluster in the back, I saw that Emma, Caleb, Sophie, James, Lily, and Noah had each produced identical pictures. A circle of trees with a dark opening in the center, and inside that opening, a figure that was vaguely humanoid but wrong. Too tall, with too many joints in its limbs, with a head that was the wrong shape, with eyes that were just black circles taking up most of its face. I stared at these 6 identical drawings and felt my mouth go dry. The children looked up at me with those unblinking eyes, and Emma said in that flat, affectless voice, "That's where we went. That's who we met. That's who sent us back." And all 6 of them smiled simultaneously, and their smiles were wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. Not the smile of children, but the smile of something imitating children, something that had studied human expressions, but didn't quite understand them. I took the drawings to Principal Hayes' office immediately. I spread them out on her desk and demanded to know what was really going on, why these children were all drawing the same disturbing image, what had actually happened to them in the woods. Principal Hayes looked at the drawings and her face went so pale I thought she might pass out. She swept them into her desk drawer and locked it, and then she grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt and told me in this urgent whisper that I needed to stop asking questions, that I needed to teach my class and go home every day and not think too hard about certain things, that Ashwood Falls had survived for over 200 years by understanding that some mysteries were better left alone. But I couldn't leave it alone. That night I did research on the town's history, scrolling through old newspaper archives online, and I found dozens of stories about children disappearing into the woods around Ashwood Falls. Some dated back to the 1800s. Most of the children were never found, declared lost to the wilderness. But occasionally, there were stories about miraculous returns. Children stumbling out of the forest after days or weeks, unharmed, unable to explain where they'd been or what had happened. I found one article from 1987 about a group of 5 children who'd gotten lost during a camping trip and were found 3 days later sitting in a perfect circle in a clearing, holding hands, completely silent. The article mentioned that the children had trouble readjusting to normal life afterward, that they seemed distant and changed, but it attributed this to trauma and didn't elaborate further. I started paying closer attention to the 6 children in my class. I watched them during lessons and noticed that they never took notes, never looked at their textbooks, but somehow they knew all the answers when I called on them. Answered, in perfect unison sometimes, which should have been impossible, which meant they were somehow connected, somehow sharing thoughts or information in a way that violated everything I understood about how human minds worked. I watched them at lunch and saw that while they pushed food around their trays, they never actually ate anything, never swallowed. And once I saw Sophie open her mouth and a piece of sandwich fell out like she'd forgotten she was supposed to chew and swallow it rather than just hold it in her mouth. The worst thing was the way they looked at me. Those 6 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement with an intensity that felt predatory, felt hungry, and I started having nightmares about those eyes following me. About waking up and finding all 6 children standing around my bed just watching me with those unblinking stares. The nightmares got bad enough that I started sleeping with the lights on, and I knew I was losing it. Knew I was letting fear and paranoia consume me. But I couldn't stop because I could feel something building, some tension increasing like pressure before a storm, and I knew something terrible was going to happen. It happened on a Friday in early October. We were doing art class, painting fall scenes, and I was walking around the room offering help and encouragement when I noticed that the 6 children weren't painting trees or pumpkins like everyone else. They were all painting that same dark opening in the forest, that same wrong figure with too many joints and too many eyes. But this time there was something new in their paintings. There were smaller figures around the large one, child-sized figures, maybe 20 or 30 of them, all standing in a circle, all facing inward toward the central figure, and I realized with a horror that made me dizzy that these were all the children who disappeared over the decades, that they were still in the woods somehow, still with that thing, and the 6 in my classroom were just extensions of it, remote viewing devices or puppets or something I didn't have words for. I must have made some sound because all 6 of them turned to look at me at exactly the same moment, their heads swiveling with mechanical precision. And Emma stood up and said, "Mr. Torres, would you like to come to the woods with us? Would you like to meet the one who waits? He's very interested in you. He's been watching through our eyes and he thinks you'd make a good addition to the circle." The other 16 children in the classroom went absolutely silent. The air felt thick, hard to breathe, and I could see my breath fogging even though it was warm in the room. The 6 children started walking toward me in perfect synchronization, their movements identical, their faces expressionless, and I backed away until I hit the wall and couldn't go any further. They stopped about 3 feet from me, standing in a line, and together they said, "Come with us. Come with us. Come with us." In this terrible chorus, their voices overlapping and echoing in a way that shouldn't have been possible in that small classroom. I ran. I pushed past them and ran out of the classroom, down the hallway, out the front doors of the school, and I kept running until I reached my car in the parking lot. I sat there shaking, watching the school entrance. And after about 5 minutes, Principal Hayes came out and walked slowly to my car and tapped on the window. I lowered it, and she said very quietly, "You need to leave Ashwood Falls, Mr. Torres. Tonight. Pack your things and go and don't come back. This town isn't safe for people who ask questions, and you've asked too many." I asked her what those children were, what had happened to them, and she closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, they were wet with tears, and she said, "They're still in the woods, the real children. They never came back. What we have now are empty things wearing their shapes, sent out as lures to bring more children into the forest, to expand the circle. It's been happening for generations. We can't stop it. We can only try to live with it and warn people like you who don't understand that some places are hungry and some things are patient, and Ashwood Falls belongs to the woods, has always belonged to the woods." I left that night, threw everything I owned into my car and drove out of town, and I haven't been back. But I can't escape what I saw because of that photograph on my phone, the one I took of those 6 paintings before I ran, the one that shows the clearing and the figure and all those small shapes standing in a circle. I've tried to delete it 1,000 times, but it always comes back, and sometimes when I look at it late at night, the small figures in the circle seem to have moved, seem to be facing different directions, and I swear sometimes there are more of them than there were before. Like the circle is growing, like the thing in the woods is still collecting children, still expanding its domain. I reported everything to the police in the neighboring county, tried to get someone to investigate, but they looked at me like I was insane and suggested I get some rest and maybe talk to a therapist. Nobody wants to believe that an entire town could be complicit in something so horrible, that parents could know their children were replaced by something else and just accept it because the alternative is worse. Because fighting back means acknowledging what's in the woods and maybe drawing its attention more fully. I've thought about going back, about trying to do something, about trying to save those children if they're still somehow alive in that forest. But I'm too afraid, and I hate myself for being afraid. But that fear keeps me alive. Keeps me far away from Ashwood Falls and the mountains and the woods that hunger. Sometimes I wonder how many towns like Ashwood Falls exist, how many small, isolated places have made deals with things that live in the wilderness, how many children go missing every year and are written off as runaways or accidents when the truth is so much worse. I wonder if that's why small towns feel strange sometimes, why certain places have that atmosphere of unspoken dread, why locals warn outsiders about going certain places or doing certain things, because they know, they've always known, that they live next to something ancient and evil, and the only way to survive is to feed it occasionally and not ask questions about the children who come back wrong. The photograph is still on my phone and it's on my computer now too, backed up to the cloud without me doing it, and I think whatever took those children wants me to remember, wants me to know that it's still out there, still waiting, still collecting, and maybe one day I'll look at that photograph and I'll see myself in the circle, a new small figure standing with all the others, and I'll know that the thing in the woods has finally decided to add me to its collection, and there won't be anything I can do to stop it because you can't fight something that exists outside the rules, something that's been feeding on children for centuries while entire towns watch and say nothing because silence is the price of survival. They told me the house had been empty for 30 years when I bought it, which should have been my first warning sign, but I was desperate and broke, and the price was so low it felt like winning the lottery. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I moved to Harrow's End in the spring of 2019 because I'd just gone through a divorce that left me with almost nothing, because I needed to start over somewhere nobody knew me, because I saw the listing for a 3-bedroom Victorian on 2 acres for less than the cost of a used car, and I thought I'd found a miracle. Harrow's End was one of those dying small towns in upstate New York where the main street had more empty storefronts than open businesses, where the population had dropped from 5,000 to barely 800, where everyone was either very old or very young because anyone with ambition had left decades ago. It seemed perfect for someone who wanted to disappear for a while, who wanted to be alone with their thoughts and figure out how to rebuild a life that had collapsed. I should have wondered why a house that big and that beautiful was so cheap. I should have asked more questions. But I was tired and desperate, and when I signed the papers and got the keys, all I felt was relief. The house was at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by overgrown gardens and forest that pressed in close on all sides. It was beautiful in a decaying sort of way. Tall windows with intricate woodwork, a wraparound porch with carved railings, a turret on the east side that gave the whole thing a fairy tale quality. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Carol, handed me the keys and said I should call her if I needed anything. Anything at all. And then she drove away so fast her tires kicked up a cloud of dust that took minutes to settle. I stood on the porch with my 2 suitcases and looked at this house that was now mine, and I felt something I couldn't quite identify, something that was part excitement and part dread, like I just made a terrible mistake but it was too late to take it back. The inside was dusty and filled with furniture covered in white sheets, like someone had left in a hurry planning to come back but never did. I walked through the rooms pulling sheets off couches and chairs and tables, revealing furniture from the 1970s or earlier, old but well made, the kind of stuff that would last forever. The house had good bones, as my mother would have said. Hardwood floors, high ceilings, big windows that let in lots of light. But it also had this smell. This faint odor like damp earth and old flowers. And no matter how many windows I opened or how much I aired the place out, that smell never quite went away. I told myself it was just because the house had been closed up for so long that it would fade once I'd been living there for a while. I was wrong about that too. The first night I spent in that house, I didn't sleep. I lay in the master bedroom on an air mattress I'd brought with me, listening to the house settle around me. And houses do make noises when they settle, I know that. Everyone knows that. But these noises were different. These noises sounded organic, rhythmic, like breathing, like the house was inhaling and exhaling, its walls expanding and contracting just slightly, just enough to make the floorboards creak and the windows rattle in their frames. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was stressed and exhausted and my mind was playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive somehow. That it was aware of me, that it was adjusting to my presence the way a body adjusts to a foreign object. I met some of the neighbors over the next few days. Old Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down brought me a casserole and told me welcome to the neighborhood in this sad voice, like she was offering condolences rather than greetings. The Harrises who lived across the road stopped by with a basket of muffins and asked me how I was settling in, and when I said fine, great actually, the house was wonderful, they exchanged this look that made my stomach clench. Mr. Harris cleared his throat and said I should know that the previous owners, the Blackwood family, they'd left very suddenly back in 1989, just packed up in the middle of the night and disappeared. And nobody had lived in the house since because people said it was cursed, said bad things happened there, said the Blackwoods had experienced some kind of tragedy, though nobody seemed to know exactly what. I laughed it off. I told them I didn't believe in curses, that the house seemed perfectly fine to me, that I was happy to have found such a beautiful place so cheap. They didn't laugh with me. Mrs. Harris put her hand on my arm and said in this very serious voice that if I ever felt uncomfortable, if I ever needed to leave in a hurry, I shouldn't hesitate. I should just go and not worry about the house or my belongings or anything else. The way she said it made me cold all over, made me want to ask what she meant, but before I could, they were walking back to their car, and Mr. Harris called over his shoulder that I should keep my bedroom door locked at night. And then they were gone. That night, the breathing got louder. I lay in bed trying to convince myself it was the wind or the old heating system or any of a dozen rational explanations, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate, in through the walls and out through the walls, and I could feel it in the floor, feel the vibration of something massive drawing air and expelling it. I turned on all the lights and walked through the house checking every room. And in the hallway, outside the master bedroom, I found something that made my blood turn to ice. The wallpaper was moving. Just barely. Just a slight ripple, like something was crawling underneath it. And when I touched it, the wall was warm. Body temperature. Warm. And I could feel a pulse beating beneath my palm. Slow and strong, like a heartbeat. I spent the rest of that night in my car, in the driveway. When morning came, I went back inside and checked the hallway, and the wallpaper was still. The wall cool and normal, and I started to wonder if I'd had some kind of breakdown, if the stress of the divorce and the move had finally snapped something in my brain. But then I saw the marks on the floor, footprints, small ones, child-sized. They led from the master bedroom down the hall to a door I hadn't opened yet, a door I'd assumed was a closet. The footprints were made of something dark and sticky, and when I knelt down and touched one, it felt like blood, but smelled like that damp earth smell that permeated the whole house. I opened the door. Behind it was a staircase going up, narrow wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness. I hadn't known the house had an attic. The real estate listing hadn't mentioned one. I stood there looking up into that darkness with my heart hammering, and I knew I should close the door, should lock it, should leave the house and never come back. But I couldn't, because I needed to know what was up there, needed to understand what was happening. I climbed the stairs slowly, using my phone's flashlight to see, and at the top I found a single room that stretched the length of the house, with a peaked ceiling and dormer windows that were covered in thick, dark curtains. The room was full of photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pinned to the walls and hanging from strings stretched across the ceiling like a web. They were all pictures of the same family, a mother, father, and 3 young children, taken over what looked like years, chronicling the kids growing from babies to maybe 10 or 11 years old. The Blackwoods, I realized. This was the family who'd lived here, who'd left so suddenly. I walked through that forest of photographs, my phone light casting strange shadows, and I saw that the later pictures showed the family looking strained, frightened, the smiles forced when they smiled at all. In one of the last photos, dated March 1989, the mother was staring at the camera with an expression of pure terror, and behind her, the wall was moving, rippling, exactly like I'd seen the hallway wallpaper move. There was a journal on a small desk in the corner. I opened it and saw entries written in a shaky hand, dated throughout 1988 and early 1989. The first entries were normal, mundane notes about daily life, but they quickly became disturbing. The mother, whose name was Patricia, wrote about hearing breathing in the walls, about feeling like the house was watching them, about her youngest daughter claiming that the house talked to her at night, whispered things through the heating vents. She wrote about finding rooms that shouldn't exist, doors that led to impossible spaces, hallways that were longer on the inside than they should have been based on the house's exterior dimensions. She wrote about her husband becoming obsessed with the house's history, spending all his time in the local library researching the property, and coming home one day with information that made him lock himself in his study for 3 days. The last entry was dated March 15, 1989. Patricia wrote that they were leaving tonight, that they couldn't stay any longer, that the house had taken her youngest daughter, Emily, and kept her for 3 days before giving her back wrong, hollow, something else wearing Emily's face. She wrote that her husband had discovered the truth about the house, that it had been built on top of something old, something that predated the town, some kind of structure or dwelling that the early settlers had found and tried to seal away by building over it. She wrote that the house wasn't haunted, it was alive, actually alive, grown from the thing beneath it like a flower from a root. And it fed on the people who lived in it, slowly absorbing them, replacing them with copies, with empty vessels it could control. I dropped the journal. I ran down the attic stairs and through the house and out the front door, and I was halfway to my car when I realized I could still feel the house, feel its attention on me like weight, like pressure. I turned back and looked at it, and I swear to God, the windows looked like eyes, the front door looked like a mouth, and the whole structure seemed to lean toward me hungrily. I got in my car and drove to the local library and found Carol, the real estate agent's number, and called her and demanded to know why she'd sold me a house with that kind of history, and she started crying and said she was sorry. She was so sorry, but the town needed someone to take it. Needed someone to occupy it because when the house was empty it started affecting other buildings, started spreading, and they'd had to condemn 2 houses near it last year because their walls started breathing too. She said the town had been feeding the house for over 100 years, selling it cheap to desperate people who didn't ask enough questions, people who would live there for a few months or years before the house finished with them, before they disappeared or left suddenly like the Blackwoods, and then the town would sell it again to the next victim. She said I could try to leave, could try to walk away, but the house had its hooks in me now, had started the process, and if I didn't go back it would come get me, would extend itself somehow, would grow new rooms and hallways that led to wherever I ran. She said the only people who escaped were the ones who burned it down, but every time someone tried the fire wouldn't take, wouldn't spread, because the house was too wet inside, too organic, and it healed faster than flames could damage it. I hung up on her. I sat in the library parking lot trying to figure out what to do, and that's when I noticed the smell, that damp earth smell. It was in my car. I looked in the back seat and saw something that made me scream. The back seat was covered in that same dark, sticky substance, the blood-earth mixture, and it was spreading, crawling up the seats, and I could see impressions forming in it, like invisible hands pressing down, like the house was reaching for me even here, miles away from the property. I drove back. I didn't know what else to do. The house was waiting, looking smug if a house can look smug, and when I walked inside it felt different, felt warmer, felt welcoming in a horrible way, like it was happy I'd returned. That was 6 months ago. I'm still here. I've tried to leave 4 times, and each time the house stops me, locks the doors, grows new hallways that lead back to where I started, makes my car not start, fills my lungs with that damp earth smell until I can't breathe. The house is patient. It's been alive for over a century and it can wait. It's changing me slowly, day by day, and I can feel it happening. My skin sometimes feels too tight, like it belongs to someone else. I find myself standing in rooms with no memory of walking there. I wake up in different parts of the house than where I fell asleep. The worst part is the children. I see them sometimes, 3 of them, the Blackwood kids, wandering the hallways looking lost and confused. I know they're not real, not anymore, just copies the house made. But they look so sad, so trapped, and I think about Patricia's journal, about Emily coming back wrong, and I wonder if some part of the real children is still in there, still aware, imprisoned inside these hollow things the house created. I'm writing this on my laptop, which still has internet somehow, though my phone stopped working weeks ago, and I'm going to try to post it somewhere, leave some kind of warning for whoever comes after me, because I know now that I won't escape, that the house is going to finish whatever process it started the day I moved in, and soon there will be someone else living here wearing my face, and the town will put the house back on the market, and another desperate person will think they found a miracle, and the cycle will continue. If you're reading this, if you're thinking about buying a house in Harrow's End or any small town where the prices seem too good to be true, please learn from my mistake. There's always a reason, always something wrong, and some bargains cost everything you have and everything you are. The breathing is very loud now. I can feel the house digesting me, pulling me in, making me part of its structure. Sometimes I touch the walls and I can feel other people in there, absorbed, trapped, their consciousness spread through the wood and plaster like blood through veins. Soon I'll join them. Soon I'll be the house, and the house will be me, and there won't be any difference anymore. It's almost a relief. I should never have agreed to move back home for the summer, but my mother was sick and my father couldn't take care of her alone, and I was between jobs anyway, so it seemed like the right thing to do, the decent thing, even though the thought of returning to Mercy Point made my skin crawl with a dread I couldn't fully explain. My name is Alex Reeves, and I grew up in Mercy Point, a coastal town in Maine with a population that hovered around 900, a place where fog rolled in thick every evening, and the smell of salt and fish and decay hung over everything, where tourists came during summer thinking it was quaint, but locals knew better. Locals knew that Mercy Point had traditions that went back centuries, traditions that outsiders weren't supposed to see. The Festival of Lights happened every year on the first weekend of September, right after Labor Day when the tourists had gone home and the town belonged to itself again. I'd participated in it every year growing up, walking in the parade with my family, wearing the traditional mask like everyone else, carrying a candle like everyone else, following the procession from the church to the harbor, and I'd never thought much about it. Never questioned why we all wore those ceramic masks that covered our entire faces. Never wondered why the festival had to happen at night. Never asked where the ceremony at the harbor actually led. Children in small towns don't ask those kinds of questions. We just do what we're told, what our parents did, what their parents did, accepting tradition as immutable law. But I'd been gone for 8 years, living in Boston, building a life away from Mercy Point, and distance had given me perspective, had made me realize that a lot of what I'd accepted as normal in my childhood was actually deeply strange. I thought about the Festival of Lights sometimes late at night, thought about those masks and the way they made everyone look identical, thought about the ceremony at the harbor where everyone would stand at the water's edge and throw their candles into the waves while the town elder spoke words in a language that wasn't English, wasn't any language I recognized. I thought about how after the festival every year there would always be someone missing, how we'd hear that old Mr. Peterson had moved away, or young Sarah Chen had gone to live with relatives out of state, or the Murphy family had decided to relocate for work, and nobody ever questioned these disappearances. Nobody ever called or wrote to these people who left. We just accepted that they were gone and moved on with our lives. I arrived in Mercy Point in early August. My mother's cancer was aggressive and the doctors had given her maybe 6 months, and I could see the disease eating away at her, making her thin and gray. But she smiled when she saw me and held my hand and said she was glad I'd come home, glad I'd be here for the festival. I felt cold when she said that, but I smiled back and said, "Of course. I wouldn't miss it." My father looked older than I remembered, more worn, and there was something in his eyes that might have been fear or sadness or resignation, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't share. The town felt smaller than I remembered and more claustrophobic, like the buildings had moved closer together, like the fog was thicker, like the ocean had crept nearer to shore. I walked the streets and recognized faces, but many of the people I'd known growing up were gone, replaced by younger families or by nobody at all, empty houses with dark windows. I ran into my childhood friend Marcus at the grocery store, and he looked shocked to see me. Actually, stepped back like I'd startled him, and when I asked how he'd been, he just said, "Fine, everything's fine," and then he made an excuse and left quickly, glancing back over his shoulder like he was afraid I might follow. I asked my mother about Marcus that evening, and she got very quiet, and then said that Marcus had been chosen 3 years ago, said it like that, chosen, and when I asked what she meant, she changed the subject and wouldn't answer no matter how many times I pressed. My father left the room entirely. I started paying more attention after that, started noticing things that didn't add up. There were 23 names on a memorial plaque outside the church, people who'd moved away over the past decade. But when I tried to look them up online, I couldn't find any trace of them. No social media, no public records, nothing, like they'd been erased from existence rather than relocated. The masks for the Festival of Lights were kept in the church basement, stored in special cabinets, and you were assigned your mask when you were 7 years old, and you kept the same one for your entire life. I remembered the day I'd received mine, remembered how proud I'd felt, how it had seemed like an important rite of passage. I asked my mother if my mask was still at the church, and she said yes, they'd been saving it. They knew I'd come back eventually, because everyone comes back for the festival. It's tradition, it's obligation, it's the way things have always been done in Mercy Point. I went to the church 2 weeks before the festival. Pastor Hollis was in his office, and he looked up when I knocked, and his expression went through surprise, and then something darker, something that might have been pity. I told him I was back for the summer and wanted to see my mask, wanted to make sure it still fit, and he hesitated for a long moment and then said, "Of course, follow me." We went down to the basement and he unlocked the cabinet room, and inside were hundreds of masks arranged on shelves, each one labeled with a name. He found mine and handed it to me, and I held it, feeling the weight of it, the smooth, cold ceramic. The masks were beautiful in a disturbing way, white faces with no expressions, just smooth blank surfaces with holes for eyes and mouth, and I realized, looking at the hundreds of them arranged on those shelves, that they were all slightly different, subtly unique, like they'd been molded from actual faces, from actual people. I said this out loud without thinking, and Pastor Hollis's hand clamped down on my shoulder hard enough to hurt. And he said very quietly that I should be careful what I noticed, what I said, that the festival was important to the town's survival, that certain sacrifices had always been necessary, and questioning them now wouldn't help anyone, least of all, me. I pulled away from him and left the church, my heart pounding, the mask clutched in my hands, and I knew then that I'd been right to be afraid, that the Festival of Lights wasn't a celebration but something else, something terrible that the town had been doing for generations. I went to the library and dug through old records, through newspapers going back to the town's founding in 1743, and I found references to the festival, to the traditions brought over from the old country, to the covenant made with the sea, to the necessary offerings that kept Mercy Point prosperous while other coastal towns struggled. The first festival had happened in 1744. 20 colonists had gathered at the harbor and performed a ceremony described in old letters as a binding, a pact with something that lived in the deep water. Something that would protect the town's fishing vessels and ensure good harvests in exchange for regular gifts, regular tributes. The letters never specified what these tributes were, but reading between the lines it was obvious. People, actual people, given to the sea every year, sacrifices wearing those ceramic masks so that nobody could see their faces, so that nobody could recognize them, so that the town could maintain the fiction that they'd simply moved away. I confronted my parents that night. I told them what I'd learned, what I'd figured out, and my mother started crying and my father just looked at me with immense sadness and said I was right, said the festival was a lottery, said everyone in town over the age of 18 was eligible and the chosen person was notified privately a week before the ceremony and they had two choices: participate willingly and their family would be compensated, would be protected, or refuse and be taken anyway, and their family would be marked, would likely be chosen next year or the year after. He said the masks existed so that nobody knew who was being sacrificed except the person themselves, so that the town could maintain its denial, could pretend that everything was normal even as they walked someone to their death. I asked if he or my mother had ever been chosen and he said no, they'd been lucky, but they'd walked in the procession dozens of times knowing that someone in the line was walking to their death, someone wearing a mask just like theirs, and they'd done nothing, said nothing, because that's what you do in Mercy Point, that's how the town survives. I asked what my mother meant when she said I'd be here for the festival and she said through her tears that she'd received the notification, that she'd been chosen, that her mask would be marked with a special symbol that only the elder could see, and she'd accepted it because she was dying anyway, because at least this way her death would mean something, would fulfill the covenant for another year. I said no, absolutely not. We were leaving tonight, all three of us, and my father shook his head and said we couldn't, said if someone chosen tried to leave the town, the thing in the water would know, would come for them and everyone they loved. That there were stories of families who'd tried to run and were found days later washed up on the beach, drowned but not by water, their lungs filled with something thick and black and wrong. He said the only escape was to never come back to Mercy Point once you left, to stay away forever, and I'd made the mistake of returning, had put myself back in the lottery, had made myself eligible again. The festival was on Saturday. On Wednesday, my mother showed me her mask and there was indeed a mark on it, a small symbol painted on the inside where nobody could see it when she wore it, a spiral that looked like it was moving even though it was just paint. She said she was at peace with it, that she'd made her choice, that I should stop fighting and just let things happen the way they were meant to happen. I said I couldn't do that, couldn't just walk in a parade while my mother went to her death, and she said I wouldn't know it was her. That's the point of the masks. That I'd be walking along with hundreds of other people and I wouldn't know which one was her until the ceremony was over and she didn't come home. I decided to switch masks. It was the only plan I could think of. On Friday night while my parents slept, I took my mother's marked mask and put it with my things, and I put my unmarked mask where hers had been. In the morning, she didn't notice the difference. The masks all looked identical, unless you checked for the interior mark, and she had no reason to check. She'd already accepted her fate. I felt terrible for the deception, but I couldn't let her die. Not like this. Not for some ancient covenant with something in the ocean. Saturday arrived. The fog was heavier than usual, turning the world into a gray, wet blur where you could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The entire town gathered at the church in the late afternoon, and we all put on our masks and picked up our candles and formed into a line, and I couldn't tell who anyone was, couldn't pick out my parents in the crowd of identical white faces, couldn't hear individual voices because everyone was silent. The only sound, the shuffling of feet and the distant crash of waves. We started walking, hundreds of us, a slow procession through the fog-shrouded streets, and I felt the weight of the marked mask on my face, felt the spiral symbol like a brand against my forehead even though I couldn't see it. We reached the harbor and arranged ourselves along the stone wall that separated the town from the sea. The water was rough, black waves crashing against the wall and spraying us with cold salt water. Pastor Hollis stood at the center, wearing a special mask that was gold instead of white, and he began to chant in that strange language, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that felt old, felt wrong, felt like it was pulling something up from the deep places. Everyone held their candles up and the flames flickered in the wind and cast dancing shadows through the fog. Then I felt it, a pull, a compulsion. My body started moving without my permission, walking forward toward the wall, and I realized the marked mask was controlling me, was directing me, and I tried to stop, but my muscles wouldn't respond. They just kept moving me forward, step by step, toward the water. I could hear my mother screaming somewhere in the crowd, could hear her calling my name, but I couldn't turn to look at her, couldn't do anything except walk toward the edge. I reached the wall. Below me, the water churned, and I could see something massive moving beneath the surface, something that made the waves move in patterns that violated physics, that made the water look thick and oily. Pastor Hollis's chanting reached a crescendo, and he pointed at me and said words that might have been, "We give this offering freely," and I felt my body prepare to jump. But then there were hands on my shoulders, pulling me back, and my father's voice in my ear saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And he ripped the mask off my face and put it on his own, and before I could react, he jumped, vaulted over the wall, and disappeared into the black water below. I screamed and lunged for him, but other hands held me back, and through my tears I saw the water where he'd entered start to glow with a pale green light. And then the light sank deeper and disappeared, and the water calmed, and the massive thing beneath the surface withdrew into the depths. The ceremony ended. Everyone filed away silently, removing their masks as they went, returning to their normal faces and their normal lives. My mother found me, and we held each other and sobbed, and nobody stopped to comfort us. Nobody said anything. They just walked past like we were invisible, because that's the rule. The unspoken rule that lets Mercy Point function. You don't acknowledge the sacrifice. You don't speak about it. You pretend it never happened. We buried an empty coffin for my father. The town chipped in for a nice headstone. Everyone said how sorry they were for our loss, said he'd been a good man, said he'd moved away to a better place. The lies were smooth, practiced, easy. My mother died 3 months later. I buried her next to the empty coffin, and then I left Mercy Point, and I've never gone back. I got letters from Pastor Hollis for a while, reminders that the festival happens every September, reminders that I'm still a resident in the town's eyes, still eligible for the lottery, reminders that if I don't return voluntarily, I might be collected involuntarily. I've moved 4 times trying to avoid the letters, but they always find me. And sometimes I wake up at night and I can smell salt water. And I know that eventually the thing in the water will come for me, will drag me back to Mercy Point, whether I want to go or not, because the covenant is eternal and nobody escapes it forever. If you're listening this and you're thinking about visiting Maine, about exploring the charming coastal towns, please stay away from Mercy Point. Don't go there no matter how picturesque it looks, no matter how friendly the people seem. That town survives on blood and lies, and it's been doing it for almost 300 years, and it will continue doing it for 300 more, feeding its god one life at a time, one masked sacrifice each September when the tourists have gone and the town can practice its horrible tradition in private. The Festival of Lights isn't a celebration, it's murder, and everyone there is complicit. And if you stay too long, you'll become complicit too, because that's what Mercy Point does. It makes you part of the lie until you can't tell where the lie ends and you begin. Thank you for wandering through the shadows of these small towns with me tonight. These stories remind us that even the quietest places can hide the darkest truths. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Dark Hours for more real horror from the places people think are safe. And before you go, drop a comment telling us the time and place you finished watching. Let's see who made it through the night. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and stay out of the dark.